This segment will deal with the fourth of the Ten Commandments, which reads as follows. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea, and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now, we really don't know very much about the early Hebrews' worship prior to the Exodus. Exodus tells us that Moses' brother Aaron was a priest, but nothing about how they organized their spiritual life. Animal sacrifices were part of it, but it's not clear what holy days and other practices they observed. Organizing the worship life of the nation was an essential step in organizing the nation itself. The Fourth Commandment is a ceremonial law from which a body of other commandments sprang, governing the manner in which worship of the nation would be conducted. An even greater body of commentaries arose, seeking to explain and interpret them, which is known as the Talmud. More on that later. We're going to talk about being spiritual and religious. Recently, a tragic and scandalous story arose in Marion, where a pastor was arrested on charges of child pornography. In a internet post I saw about it, people were making all sorts of comments, and among them was this one, which was fairly typical. Someone wrote, "Reasons like this are the exact reason I do not believe in going to church. You do not need church to have faith in a higher being in your heart. Sunday morning saints, Monday morning sinners." The TV and movie star Ron Perlman has been quoted as saying, "I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. I have my own relationship with a being that I consider to be everywhere, all and everything. I don't need a church or a synagogue or a mosque. I don't need to kneel down. I don't need to stand up. I don't need to be hanging from a thread." I'm not sure what that last comment means, but you get the gist. You hear all sorts of people saying they're spiritual but not religious, claiming they don't need and don't want to participate in some kind of organized religious worship or spiritual practice. Something I've heard many times in my life is, "I can worship God on the golf course as well as in church." Well, having been on a few golf courses in my life, I can say that I have heard the name of God invoked on the golf course, but not always in the most reverential of ways. I remember an old fellow who my dad and I paired up with many years ago on the course. And every time that guy took a chop at the ball, he'd let loose with a stream of invective. He didn't like anything he hit. And this went on for 9 holes. Every time. On the tee of the ninth hole, he takes a swing, the ball goes off, and I finally sidled over to Dad and I said, "Why does he even play the game?" And my dad got this sideways grin and said, "Relaxes him." I said, "He's about to relax himself into a coronary." The truth is that people who eschew the church because they say it's full of smug, self-righteous people can become pretty smug and self-righteous themselves. Case in point, I had a bishop years ago who, as a student at the Chicago School of Theology, was hired to act as a waiter at a reception for the famous and celebrated architect Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright was a genius, and if you doubted it, he'd be happy to tell you so. But yes, he really was a genius. Well, during this reception, the young bishop-to-be actually found himself face to face with the great man, and he said, "Mr. Wright, I want to tell you that I'm a great fan of your work." And Wright accepted this as his due. and then said, "And tell me, young man, what do you do?" And he said, "Well, I'm a student at the University of Chicago School of Theology." And Wright derisively snorted and said, "Oh, you're one of those people who took history's greatest poet and turned him into an institution." Well, at that moment, the young student was put down by this snappish remark and just slunk away. But later he thought of the response he should have given, which was, "Yeah, and if it weren't for the institution, you would have never heard of the poet." Now, I dare say we all have struggles with organized religion, whether we're inside of it or outside of it. You want to hear people talk about their struggles and frustrations with organized religion? Talk to a pastor, talk to a member of the clergy. They've got plenty of them. But the problem is that the alternative to organized religion is disorganized religion. Years ago, I led a mission team to Joplin, Missouri, which had 1 year previous been utterly devastated by a terrible tornado. Many people were killed and hundreds of buildings were just obliterated. In the time following that, thousands and thousands and thousands, in fact, 120,000 volunteers had come from all over the nation to help rebuild the city. And the overwhelming majority of them were church people who had been organized to do this work. And when they got there, they did their work through various organizations that the churches had set up to deploy these volunteers. One of the most iconic scenes of that storm and the aftermath was the community hospital, which took a direct hit and was all but hollowed out by the storm. In the months that followed, the community built a memorial park right across the street from the ruins of the hospital. We went to visit it, and there we encountered a woman who saw our T-shirts we were wearing, which named our church, and she asked, "Are you a part of a mission team?" And we said, "Yes." She said, "Well, on the night of the tornado, I lost my home, my job, and my best friend. And in the time that followed, she tried to find some purpose for her life, and she found it by going to work for the Salvation Army, a church. And there she helped organize and deploy these mission teams from other churches that came from all over the country. And she said altogether, there'd been 120,000 of them. Now, I've been to numerous disaster sites over the years with mission teams, and I have almost never encountered anyone who wasn't an active part of a church or some other worshiping body. No one who just said, "Well, I'm spiritual, so I'll go and just show up and see what I can do to help." It doesn't work that way. In fact, a friend of mine had a friend who was an EMT, and in the aftermath of the tornado, he decided he would go to see what he could do to help. He's not a church person, he's not a Christian, and had no contact with any churches. When he got to Joplin, he simply assumed there would be someone who would recognize his skills and tell him where he could be most useful. But in fact, at that point, the government and the Red Cross, a very respectable secular organization, were in ruins themselves. And he said the two groups that had their act together, the moment they hit the ground and were doing the most work to help the community recover at that point, were the Salvation Army and the United Methodist Committee on Relief. Other church organizations were also rapidly moving in, and they just knew what to do, how to do it, and had the resources because they were organized to do so. Guys like him simply had to hook up with them because by themselves, they were actually worse than useless. They were in the way. The command to establish a day of worship was the first step in organizing a religion that could carry on the witness and promote acts of justice and compassion. The word religion itself comes from the Latin root religare, which means to bind. The point is to bind us to God and to one another in a formal, open, and clear way. Now, healthy spirituality united with healthy religion is really a tightrope walk. It's so easy to fall on one side or the other. But when you get the balance right, it can change you and it can change the world. A spirituality that is anchored in you alone inevitably becomes about you alone. Martin Luther King once noted self-centered people are little solar systems within themselves, but they can't see beyond that. Meanwhile, if religion just takes over to such a degree that you're bound up in the rules, the regulations, and the legalism, that can be a problem. One of my favorite authors, Frederick Buechner, writes, "The law of Moses became the legalism of the Pharisees, with whom Jesus frequently tangled. And can mortals be righteous before God becomes, is it kosher to wear my dentures on the Sabbath?" Jesus frequently fought this battle. In one of his most famous confrontations with religious authorities, he encountered a man whose hand was withered. Now, it's likely this had been, if not a lifelong condition, one that he'd had for a very long time. It was not life-threatening, it was crippling. Now, this man comes to him on the Sabbath, and the rules that the religion had established for observing the Sabbath by honoring the Fourth Commandment included you should do no work, and that includes healing. There was an important proviso. If a person's life was in danger, you could work as hard as you needed to save and preserve that individual's life. That was the greater good. But this guy was not in that kind of danger. He could wait a few hours until the sun set on the Sabbath, and it was a new day by their reckoning. But Jesus says, is there any reason why I shouldn't do this now? And he heals the man right then and there, which makes the religious figures there, the Pharisees, go ballistic. You're dishonoring God. You're disrespecting the commandment. To which Jesus responds, the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. He sets a priority that allows us to strike that healthy balance between spirituality and religion. The biblical scholar John Dominic Crossan notes, in the Hebrew Bible, God says, I reject your worship because of your lack of justice. God never says, I reject your justice because of your lack of worship. Some of the earliest struggles in the church were over the forms of religious observance, such as the dietary law, circumcision, observing the Sabbath, because the earliest Christians had come from the Jewish faith. The first Christians were Jews, and they worshipped on the Sabbath. But as the demographics of the faith began to change and the majority of Christians started to come from Gentile, non-Jewish origins, they had no Sabbath tradition, and they were not welcome in Jewish houses of worship. Even if they wanted to go into a synagogue or into the temple in Jerusalem, they were barred from doing so. And as a consequence, Christians took to congregating on Sunday, the day Jesus had been raised from death, and they called that the Lord's Day. It seemed appropriate for a new era in a sense, because the Sabbath had ended the week, but the Lord's Day ushered in a new one. And thus, over time, the vast majority of Christians came to the point where their worship, their organized spirituality, was practiced on the Lord's Day, on Sunday. But the concept of the Sabbath is still there. The idea that we do need to set time apart. We need to organize our lives to make a formal commitment to worship and study. Also to rest. One of the reasons the Sabbath was established was to tell the Israelites, you are free people now. You are no longer slaves. You don't have to work every day. But in the process of remembering the Sabbath, they were to remember who had freed them and to reflect on that, upon their relationship to their God and to one another. The Sabbath and religion in general are meant to provide a structure whereby we can live out what are the ultimate spiritual priorities of life. And for Jesus, that boiled down to two commandments, two rules. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The structure was meant to help facilitate that, to remind you of its importance, to help you think about how you go about doing that. Jesus calls himself the Lord of the Sabbath. When we're looking for guidance on how to do this love, how to love God, how to love one another, we look to him as our guidance. He is the Sabbath. And when we do look to him, we find strength and peace and rest. That's what we structure our lives around. And when we do it right, both our religion and our spirituality are made whole in Jesus Christ.